So also pointed out that the one thing that seems to unify most of the ideas that used to be made about myth was that they were centered on humans, and that humans are the only primary holders of any kind of truth in the world, and that is called anthropocentrism. Now, this is a reasonably common knowledge for anthropologists who used to have this idea of ethnocentrism. So, ethnocentrism is when we judge cultures by our own culture. But you could extend that to the broader scale that we judge the cultures of the world based on the fact that humans are the only culture of the world. So, Cassirer says they were convinced that a rational theory of human nature was the first desideratum of any philosophic theory. All the other questions that had been treated in pre Socratic thought were declared to be secondary and subordinate. From then on, man was no longer regarded as mere part of the universe, it became its center. Man, said Protagoras, is the measure of all things. This tenet holds, in a sense, both for the sophists and for Socrates. To humanize philosophy, to turn cosmogony and ontology into anthropology was their common goal. Now, ontology is the topic of this week, and we'll bring that back up a little bit later, but this is the beginning of our thought here, partly because we put the humans at the center, and especially we put the specific kind of Western European human as the center of all research and all science that tended to exclude things that were not only non-European, but also things that were non-human. And obviously, other cultures, other people in the world were not so interested in these. But the result of this is that, by and large, when we think of the world today, it is through a science that is focused on how this affects human. For example, pollution is bad because humans won't survive, or hurting animals is bad because humans empathize with them. And obviously, there's a broader relevance to animals and the planet is that if humans disappeared tomorrow, the planet would continue. It would find a way to continue in a way that humans have not. So these things, in as much as they are connected currently, are not necessarily connected and necessarily don't need one another to exist. And in the sense that science was developed along these lines, this is also the way that we have tended to see most of the world, generally speaking. For example, as we mentioned last week, through the scientific experiments that were made over the 19th and 20th century, we also saw aliens as these kind of more or less science experiments. But here's another example here. Telescopes suggested that the Earth was hardly the center of the universe. John Ray, for one, thought it conceivable that there were living beings on other planets, possibly even on the moon. How could such ideas square with the notion that all life served humankind? At the other end of the scientific spectrum, the microscope revealed a complex community on which people seem to depend rather than the other way around. Anton von Leeuwenhoek, a pioneer microbiologist, knew that there were more tiny creatures in his mouth than there were people in Holland. Explorers revealed the existence of vast uninhabited wilderness on the face of the earth that were teeming with life, perfect and complete in and of themselves, and never even seen by humans. In sum, the more humans learned about nature, the more difficult it became to entertain the notion that the universe, or even the vacant field down the street, existed for humans. So obviously, that same conversation extends to considering the Earth at the center of the universe and the Copernican revolution that we mentioned last week. That it used to be this geocentric view of the universe where the Earth was at the center because it was all we knew. But then, with the use of the telescope, we realized that the sun is at the center of our universe, and that's heliocentrism. And perhaps if we can look further out of our galaxy, we might find that there is another much larger system that we are part of. Even making sense out of the smallest parts through microbiology, however close we can look at it, we also see that there is some level of the small that even escapes us at this point. So if there's an infinitely big and an infinitely small that we are stuck somewhere in, we have to reconsider our position within that world. And As Nash points out here, this was already existing in ancient Greece, and as Cassira pointed out, this is also something that existed before Socrates. But the general understanding of the world seems to evolve based on what we can see, what we can touch, what we can experience firsthand, and anything further than that seems to be much further. So as we discover more things, we also shift our point of view towards those things that are maybe much bigger, maybe much smaller, or in the simplest term, things that are just different from ourselves. And the most different from ourselves, of course, is aliens, but every kind of creature we have seen so far was another part of that difference. That is part of what has been called in Western science the great chain of being. That is this metaphor that puts us on some scale of relationship with others, of belonging in a world with others that starts at the bottom from the plants and goes all the way to heaven. And humans are part of the animals somewhere on this line. So obviously, in this context, this is also the human male, that is the male alone and not women. And of course, I've mentioned before that women tend to be very easily pictured as monsters. And more generally speaking, anything that is non-Christian, non-white, non-European, etc., would become excluded from these lines because the people who were white Christian males were also the center of the universe. So, little by little, we reconsider all of the knowledge about the world by becoming aware of it, by changing our shifting our point of view from understanding others as not fundamentally different from us, but like us, but others. So, pagan animism, whatever it was called for a long time, once we realize that it is just another form of belief that is slightly different from ours, becomes a very different concept, not the belief of savages or barbarians, or whatever they were called at the beginning of the semester, but the beliefs of fully formed societies with their fully formed understanding of the world that just so happens to be different from ours. The thing is that they just hadn't considered two very important parts, or they had laid too much importance on two different parts. Number one, similarity. Of course, we know that once people can look in very similar ways, we have this magical association of ideas. So this is from Darwin. Independently of the question of fertility and sterility, in all other respects, there seems to be a general and close similarity in the offspring of crossed species and of crossed varieties. If we look at species as having been specially created and at varieties as having been produced by secondary laws, this similarity would be an astonishing fact. But it harmonizes perfectly with the view that there is no essential distinction between species and varieties. So Darwin points out that the reason why sometimes we find similarities between different humans is that there is a connection, a physical, biological, quote unquote, natural connection between things. Now, it might be very complex one that is not immediately obvious, but it still exists. Now, the opposite of that, as he points out, is an astonishing fact. It's just a big coincidence. But if God has a plan for all this, then that coincidence has a reason as well, just a reason that is not one we are able to grasp. Once Darwin introduces his principle of evolution, or really lineage with modification, or historical lineage with modification, then we start to be able to think completely differently about our relationship to humans. And you might be surprised that Darwin was also pointing out that there is an issue of proximity here. The contact with others is what made us more aware of others. I endeavored also to show that intermediate varieties from existing in lesser numbers than the forms which they connect will generally be beaten out and exterminated during the course of further modification and improvement. The main cause, however, of innumerable intermediate links not now occurring everywhere throughout nature depends on the very process of natural selection, through which new varieties continually take the places of and supplant their parent forms. But just in proportion as this process of extermination has acted on an enormous scale, so much the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed be truly enormous. So this is rather clear here that we see those things that are closest to us, the most obvious, and then the more we pay attention to that, the more these things become relevant. And conversely, we see those things that are furthest from us as things that are going to disappear, that are supposed to become no longer part of our world. So essentially, we are asking a question of belonging here. And when Darwin puts our belonging not on a straightforward line that goes from A to B, that goes from the depth of the earth to the top of the heavens, then we must absolutely review our point of the universe as a part that has all of these intermediate varieties, out of all of these these other versions of us, of ourselves, of humans, of humanity, of even others, before we can place ourselves in that world. And in this context, Darwin views, or really reviews, the great chain of being as this weird tree things. This is part of his and the notes that he has on the origin of species, and you can see at the top there he says I think, and he has these weird dendrites that connect and disconnect with one another, that follow not a straight path or along an unpredictable idea. So Darwin thought that there is, of the grand order of the universe, some kind of a pattern of relationships between different things that he associated with the tree of life, which also exists, by the way, in Christian cosmology. He's not going against anything that was pre-existent before, but he is pointing out to a completely different view and even a completely different metaphor of the thing that people have tended to call nature. Is that up until this point, we were disconnected from nature. We saw ourselves as these cultural animals that have abandoned nature, or that are slowly abandoning nature, when in fact we should have seen ourselves as some part of nature, perhaps a transitional stage that we have called previously liminality. We are somewhere on some kind of threshold between the natural, the basic level of nature, and the cultural, the abstract level of culture that we today are inhabiting. And as a result of that, perhaps everything else that we exist in the world should be seen within that same space of liminality. After all, we humans today have this somewhat privileged space being on Earth alive, as opposed to all the things in the universe that are not on Earth and not alive. And that is quite magical in its own regard. So, science fiction here opens up a very different door to asking ourselves where we are, because, of course, we have this very specific understanding of how we got to be, and especially this very specific understanding of how evolution came to be as well. But there's a book from Olaf Stapledon that explores the possibility that aliens might have been just a different evolution from ours. It was in this district and shortly after summer dawn that the Martians were first seen by men. Early walkers noticed that the sky had an unaccountably greenish tinge, and that the climbing sun, though free from cloud, was wan. Observers were presently surprised to see the green concentrate itself into 1,000 tiny cloudlets, with clear blue between. Field glasses revealed within each fleck of green some faint hint of ruddy nucleus and shifting strands of an infrared color, which would have been invisible to the earlier human race. These extraordinary specks of cloud were all of about the same size, the largest of them appearing smaller than the moon's disk. But in form, they varied greatly and were seen to be changing their shapes more rapidly than the natural cirrus, which they slightly resembled. In fact, though there was much that was cloud-like in their form and motion, there was also something definite about them, both in their features and their behaviors, which suggested life. Indeed, they were strongly reminiscent of primitive amoeboid organisms seen through a microscope. So, now that we understand that there's an infinitely small, perhaps those infinitely small parts that we are made out of could be made very differently, and perhaps these other aliens out there are made out of a different arrangements of the atoms themselves. Obviously, the 20th century could only have born this kind of story once we figure out all of these different possibilities that we are in. But in here, these little tiny parts, tiny cells are still ruddy. That is red colors, just like the humans are supposed to be. They are just part of the same things that we are made of, but arranged differently. And of course, the questions becomes at this point that our place in the world is often informed by us being the only people in the universe and the only quote unquote men in this universe. And Stapleton is looking at this point of origin of people, if the history of humanity from the present onwards, according to the last 2 billion years or so, came out to be whoever we are. What if there was a different path that had been taken along those years that we just couldn't see, this cloud-like form that was invisible until now, that 2 billion years ago, another kind of ancient human started to exist that is not like us. Now, in this story, there are 18 different distinct human species that exist, and we are just the first of them. And through the different iterations, different visions of humans are created. So the evolution of mankind is seen as a completely different process than our reasonably short-sighted vision of what we have known for the past few hundred years. That's as much. So this book is called Last and First Men, written in 1930, and looking at the different evolutions of astronomy, of biology, and figuring out how we have this story of the human that whose quote unquote history starts in the 19th century, that is with our modern science, but continues throughout the years, especially through traveling through space and whatever. Curiously, through though science had long ago destroyed the belief in personal immortality as an intrinsic attribute of man, a complementary belief had grown up to the effect that those who justified themselves in action were preserved eternally by special miracle in the swift spirit of Godrepos. Thus, from childhood to death, the individual's conduct was determined by the obligation to produce as much motion as possible, whether his own muscular activity or by the control of natural forces. In the hierarchy of industry, 3 occupations were honored almost as much as the sacred order of scientists, namely flying, dancing, and athletics. Everyone practiced all 3 of these crafts to some extent, for they were imposed by religion. But the professional flyers and aeronautical engineers and the professional dancers and athletes were a privileged class. So the humans that we were reduced our activity to only a handful of things because we're so obsessed with movement, and that the movement is what makes us the humans. We recognize ourselves by being the active people, the people who make things, the people who build things, the people who make stuff out of their lives, who till the fields and whatever. Those, since the 19th century, have been described as the only kind of worthy humans. Everybody else was supposed to be extinct. Everybody else was supposed to disappear in the grand picture of the earth. And of course, we only figured out that we could perhaps affect these ideas through controlling evolution. So Stapleton points out that different types of humans over the years tried to affect their own evolutionary path through something that looks like eugenics. Of course, this is written in the 1930s. This is a realistic question that people were asking at the time. In short, it was only after many failures and after many barren epochs during which, for a variety of reasons, the enterprise was neglected, that the fourth man, so the fourth type of human that existed, did at length fashion 2 individuals almost precisely of the type they had originally designed. These were produced from a single fertilized ovum in laboratory conditions. Identical twins, but of opposite sexes, they became the Adam and Eve of a new and glorious species, the fifth man. It may be fittingly said that the fifth men that they were the first to attain true human proportions of body and mind. On the average, they are more than twice as tall as the first men and much taller than the second men. So we are the truly humans by being much taller than we are now, because so far we have only been in this experimental period. We are only trying to figure out how things work. And according to the book here, the first man, that is us, fail to achieve our goal. And the second man also failed. The third man also make it, but they spend too much time losing effort doing movements and not really trying to make sense out of the life. Only when the humans are making sense of their lives, only when they start to put themselves on a much higher level of understanding, do they get to be the full blown humans of the fifth men. The fifth men have great accomplishments in arts and science and philosophy and pretty much everything you can imagine. They abandon language, they communicate telepathically, which is much more useful. They can travel mentally, astral project. They keep on finding out more ways to be more perfect, and eventually they figured out that this too is pretty boring, and they really start to lose sight of their own life as well. So another generation of humans comes after that. Very seldom, only in rare moments of clarity, only after ages of misapprehension did a few of them here and there, now and again, begin to have the deeper insight into the world's nature and man's. And no sooner had this precious insight begun to propagate itself that it would be blotted out by some small or great disaster, by epidemic disease, by the spontaneous disruption of society, by an access of racial imbecility, by a prolonged bombardment of meteorites, or by the mere cowardice and vertigo that dared not look down the precipice of the fact. Yeah, there's a lot of things that might get in our way of self-understanding, but most often the people do. The people, by their short-sightedness, fail to realize that they have a lot more to find about themselves, to learn about others, and to learn about life, and they are sometimes very happily content with what they have found, not knowing that there's much more to be found. Much more could be these mythical characters that today we see as disappeared, as inexistent, as fictitious of some sort, but could also be helping us expand our horizons.